For anyone who is starting out with macro tracking, it's pretty common, especially with platform, if you are actually tracking your macronutrients like protein, fat, carbohydrates, etc., to use an app, just simply because it's easier and more convenient to log it on your phone than write down on a piece of paper. Generally speaking, there are two apps that are pretty popular. There are a whole wealth of apps you can choose from, but the two most common ones that we have experience with are My Macros Plus and MyFitnessPal. So I'm hoping this is going to be like a really quick intro guide that'll be helpful for some of the features in My Macro Plus. It's the one that I personally use, although I am MyFitnessPal, My Macros Plus. There's not a huge difference between the two. Small features. I know they both have paid options. I use the free one from My Macros Plus, and I'm going to show some of the tricks and why I personally use it. And hopefully, if you don't know any of these tricks, it'll be a little bit helpful. But you should be able to see the screen from my phone app. My Macros Plus is this orange one up in the top left. So once you download it and get it installed and you open up the app, this is generally what your screen is going to look like. I think there's a little bit of difference based on if you're an Android or Apple user. What this looks like, but for the most part, it's the same. It should be relatively straightforward. So at the very top, you've got your dates. So those are where you're logging your actual macronutrients. So right now I have like tomorrow highlighted. Generally speaking, you're going to be putting your nutrients and your information in on today's date. I just have stuff in there right now, so I wanted to start with a blank sheet. That's why I have it on tomorrow. You can scroll across those dates and look back historically at what you've eaten. Or if you actually are planning ahead for something, like you know you're going to get pizza or you're stopping at McDonald's on a road trip this upcoming weekend, you can actually log stuff ahead of time, which is incredibly useful. And it helps plan ahead, which is a great thing, but maybe a more advanced feature. But this is what your screen should look like. You can see I haven't added anything yet. And if you click in the top right, those three dots, what you're going to get is this screen here that pops up, this menu. I'm not going to go through every single one of these details, but there's two important ones. Copy day is one that if you're eating the same things, which generally speaking we don't recommend, but it does happen, especially if you are meal prepping and you have the same type of meals, that you can copy an entire day. Super useful, super quick and convenient, but the one that's most important to us is the top one, change macro goals. So when you have macronutrients, if you're working with a coach, you're going to get a set of targets. You can go into this and change your own nutrients in your app or your own targets in your app. You can see I have a whole bunch of them in here for random different things. I've actually stopped adding different profiles. Some of these were to denote certain massing cycles or cutting cycles that I was on. But now generally I just go into the same one and modify my current cycle instead. So you can actually click on one of these titles like December 29th and go in and adjust those macros, or create a brand new one by scrolling all the way down to the bottom and saying add new macro goal and title it. And it lets you put in all of your targets that you want to set. So that's kind of step one. You want to have your targets. If you have a coach that's assigned you targets. If you're just starting tracking and you want to see roughly what you're eating in a day, this isn't that important. You're not going to need those targets. You'll be able to capture what you're eating on a daily basis just by using the app, which might be a good starting point. Coming back out of this, the reason you put those targets in is right under those dates that I was talking about. You'll see the 190 grams of protein, 345 grams of carbs, 81 grams of fat. Those are my targets right now. So at the top of the screen, I have my daily targets. And once I start putting food in, it's going to say how much I have left. So if I have a protein shake that's about 25 grams of protein, I'm going to have my protein draw down to 165 once I enter that in. So it's like a tracker or a bar of like how much you have left in a given day. So that's kind of 101 of how to read and interpret the app. And this is going to be 90% of what you see when you're using it. Some of the other really cool features. So if I actually go back here, the top left menu bar, this is kind of the primary navigation page for My Macros Plus. This is the menu that opens up. There's some really useful stuff in here, and there's some stuff that I don't use ever. I'm going to talk about the ones I use just because I personally find them helpful. The big ones are really the customs and faves at the top. Those are things that I eat repeatedly, regularly, that weren't in a database entry. So I have them stored in customs and favorites, so they're really easily accessible. If you have like a custom food or an item that you've got at the grocery store, you can't find anything in the database that you've manually entered, really quick to go in there and grab it. So alcohol is a big thing that we track differently with platform than most people track. We don't use the nutrition label. So I put things in like some of the pale ales that I'm drinking where I can just automatically say, I know what this beer is, and it'll track it as carbs. or it'll track it as fat, whichever I want to use. And I have those built into my customs and favorites. Recent, I don't use too often, but I think you get the gist of what that is. Recipes is huge. Recipes is probably the coolest feature here, in my opinion. And then there's another two that I'll come back and talk to, but recipes is really huge. That allows you to actually build more advanced recipes the same way you're cooking them. You have an actual ingredient list with a quantity that you are cooking and creating a meal with. You can build that into your recipes, and then you weigh the total output of what you've made, and it will auto calculate the entire macronutrient of that dish, the entire breakdown of protein, carbs, fat, fiber. So if you go into recipes, I have a list right now. So these are all the recipes that I've built in that I may use again in the future or modify slightly in the future. But if I pick on one, I think I use Adam's chili, and my naming convention's not good, so you should be better with your naming convention to keep track of stuff. But here's an example of one of my recipes. You can see nothing's in here right now. It's 1 gram, 0.1 grams of protein. That doesn't mean anything. But in the top right, you can actually go up and edit the recipe and see what's in here. So when I made this specific meal, I created a meal that had 3/4 of a cup of this chicken stock, 315 grams of bell pepper, 1.75 cups of black beans, a pound of 93% lean turkey, a cup of tomato sauce, 268 grams of onions, 139 grams of tomatoes. That's everything that went into that dish. And then after I was done cooking, I weighed the total output. It was 1,685 grams. The reason that you put in that total weight at the end is because when I'm serving myself and there's all these ingredients and I have no idea exactly what's in each one and I don't want to track all these individual ingredients, it will break it down for me. So if I serve myself 150 grams in a bowl, it'll auto calculate your protein, your fat, and your carbs, and this is stored for later. So especially helpful for meal prep, also especially helpful for some more advanced, I'll say, recipes. Not that this recipe was hard to cook by any means, but harder to input or track from a macronutrient standpoint. So the way to do this is really just to start from scratch. You add a recipe, and then you name it something, and then you add another ingredient, that thing that's right at the top here. And that add another ingredient actually pulls up this menu where you can search for ingredients in various different ways. So you can use your customs. So if I have onions or bell peppers built in, I can grab them from there. I can add a custom ingredient if I have the nutrition label, or if I found something on like Nutritionix. They also have a barcode scanner, and then search for ingredient, which is the most common. So like chicken breast. If I'm using chicken breast in a recipe, I'll just go and search for a chicken breast entry, which I actually do in this example. You see chicken breast right here. There's a bunch of different entries. So you can select one in here, and that's going to add to your recipe, and then you just have to make sure you put in the correct quantity. That's why I really, really like recipes. And then at the end of that, like I said, you just, whatever you're serving yourself, you put in that serving size for that recipe, and it will auto calculate everything. Recipes and customs are the two things that I really use most. And just going back here in that recipes menu, here is that create new recipe entry to start something from scratch. There are two other features of the menu on here, which I will find on here. Just give me 2 seconds. There we go. So the other two that I work on here, or that I use on here regularly, are the two bottom ones. Nutrition label scanner and barcode scanner. And I will actually say I really only use the barcode scanner. I actually just used the nutrition label scanner for the first time, and it's a feature that I didn't actually know was on here, but it seems to be helpful. Barcode scanner is exactly what it sounds like. You can scan something that's packaged, like a frozen pizza or something like that, and it should pull up the nutrition, or should be able to pull up the nutrition label. It's not perfect. Sometimes you have to double check or manually enter them, but I'd say 70 to 80% of the time it works. Nutrition label scanner is not scanning the barcode. You're actually taking a picture of the actual nutrition label, and it will find the line items next to the nutrition and put it in for you. All you have to do is title the food and put the brand name in. That one's actually pretty helpful. So if the barcode scanner doesn't work, you might be able to get away with using the nutrition label scanner. I don't use the by type. I don't use by brand. I don't use Fast Track particularly often. And then the bottom, add custom food, I do use if there's no nutrition available and I need to put something in from Nutritionix. So those are the ones I use. I think that's a pretty high level but encompassing summary of using My Macros Plus. Try and go back if I went over some of that stuff pretty quickly. I think recipes I went over pretty quickly, but once you get used to it, if you build an example recipe, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You'll be able to get into it and start using it pretty quickly and see just how helpful that really is. And that's really all it is, all you need to get started with My Macros Plus. MyFitnessPal overlaps with this 90%. Some slight user interface differences, but for the most part, it's the exact same. They have the same general functionality and same features. I actually think they're driven off of similar, if not the same database APIs. So they're really pulling in the same foods. The database for one or the other is probably slightly larger, depending on how many databases they're querying and how many users they have entering different things. But if you can master one, you can generally pick up the other one pretty quickly. So hopefully that was helpful. That was my 5-minute, 10-minute, I guess, really high-level overview of My Macros Plus, and hopefully you guys are taking away at least a trick or two from that explanation.